Hey everyone, we are continuing our conversation into our unit of looking at gender and feminism, things like that. Prior to today, we took a look at conversations of like women's roles in United States history, starting all the way back from the 1800s, getting up into the Industrial Revolution era. So today we're going to continue kind of looking at the history of gender and women's rights and starting to get into the conversation of talking about politics. So I want you to consider these two questions as we go through the conversation topics of today. What tactics were used to start the conversations about women's rights, and how do people make change? Okay, so we've talked about moments of activism. What does activism look like to you in our first unit of the course? Okay, so moving on from there, how do we start to see some of these things in action? Okay, and just know as we're talking about all of these different conversations, we're going to stick to kind of more of the bare bones of the moments and the dates that we're looking at. I highly recommend you digging deeper into these, but I am again just making sure that I stick to the standards and don't dive deeper than we need to. And if you are interested or have any questions, I highly recommend that you reach out to me and I can guide you on where to start looking, or we can have those kind of conversations. Okay, but otherwise we're going to stick to some of those more basic conversations. So when we left off our conversations, we started to see that women were entering into the workforce, right? So because of that, we're going to start seeing this change of women's roles even in society. So one of the first major moment for women is on April 2nd of 1917. We have Jeannette Rankin from Montana, and she is the first woman that is elected to our Congress. Okay, so prior to this, it was only men who were serving in Congress. So finally, we were starting to have women in the places where conversations and decisions are being made. August 18th, 1920, so again, this is only 100 years ago, we have a ratification of the 19th Amendment. Okay, this is the amendment which determined that you cannot be denied voting rights based on sex. Okay, so this was the right to vote, big moment, because prior to this it was again just men that were voting, so this was a big moment. And it not only provided votes for white women, but also African American women, women of color. Okay, so this was a really big amendment that encompassed a lot more than just women. It was a huge civil rights moment across the country. Hard worked for, and it actually ended up having a lot of protests that were tied to this. Women who were arrested for having marches, women who were arrested for loitering, or even starting some riots because they were upset. And you will definitely talk about this instance when you get into U.S. history, but there were women who were jailed and then refused to eat. And the U.S. government didn't want these women to pass away because they didn't want a martyr, someone who sparks inspiration for others, right? They didn't want that. So the U.S. government does some really interesting things, some horrific things to keep women alive in order to kind of fight back against the ratification of this 19th Amendment. But definitely one of the biggest moments for women's rights in our history as a country. So as the World Wars, World War I, World War II happen, our workforce, made up primarily of men during this time, they're gone. They are sent across the ocean, and now we have a lot of open jobs that need to be filled because we still need to manufacture things here in the country. And so we end up seeing a lot of women being not only joining but encouraged to join the workforce by the government. There were posters like you see on the image here where we've got apply, U.S. Employment Service, do the job he left behind. We see women getting into these really dingy and dirty jobs that once were only left for men. Welding, auto mechanics, all of those really kind of gender-based jobs originally, now we have women that are getting into this career. So women were replacing those men, and then once the world wars kind of finished up and our men came home, there really wasn't a great argument anymore for keeping women in the house anymore, right? Because we just learned women kept the nation going while the men were away fighting in these wars. How can we tell them to stop doing it or that they aren't capable of doing it anymore? So we're after this point in time, we're going to see a lot of women joining into the workforce. Now, keep in mind when I say women are joining the workforce, it's going to be primarily in secretarial positions, teachers, librarians, some of those more maybe gender thought of roles. But again, we are starting to see women not just staying at home taking care of the kids anymore. And that was really due to the fact that so many men, again, were gone and they had these open positions and we needed to keep running as a country. So women took up that responsibility. Following this, we get into our civil rights era, which is 1950s, 1960s. Okay, so previously to this time, we know from some of our other units that we have seen the civil rights era play a role. We saw it when we were talking about our racism unit, maybe into our religion unit. Okay, there was different big just change, movements happening legally. And so women were also getting in on these big moments of change and increasing civil rights. So starting with May 9th of 1960, one of the biggest changes to women having a voice is the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, approved the first commercially produced birth control pill. Okay, so you can see in the upper right-hand corner here of the slide what that kind of looks like. Okay, and so women were able to get a prescription from their doctors, and then they would take the pill. And this was a big change for women. It allowed women to control their reproduction. Previously to this, there wasn't really anything to stop this. Okay, and there wasn't that control from women, or allowing women to have kind of that control over their bodies if they didn't want something. They didn't want children. Okay, so a big voice for women having control over their bodies. July 2nd, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act. Again, we've heard of this most likely before in other history classes or when we were talking about our racism unit, talking about the different laws that were passed. Well, women were included in this bill. Okay, so we see that within the Civil Rights Act, we see Title VII. Okay, that's the portion of it or the section of the law which bans employment discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and sex. Okay, so you are no longer allowed to say, I don't want to hire that person because they're black. I don't want to hire that person because they are Jewish. Okay, same when it comes to being a female. You could no longer be discriminated on based on your sex. Okay, so there was equal opportunity when it comes to terms for seeking employment. Okay, continuing on, now we're getting into the 1970s, the 1990s. In the 1970s, we have what's called the Equal Rights Amendment introduced into Congress. Okay, we also refer to this as the ERA. Okay, so it was a big topic just a couple years ago, but we'll talk about that next week. The ERA essentially asked for a guarantee for equal legal rights for all American citizens regardless of sex. So the idea was that you would be protected legally under the law no matter what your sex was. And it also sought to end the legal distinctions between men and women in terms of divorce, property, employment, and other matters. Okay, so when you think about who gets children, if there's a divorce between partners, women being able to apply for a mortgage or have a bank account on their own without having a man on the account with them, whether that be their husband or their father. All of that wasn't legally protected, and it's actually still not legally protected because the Equal Rights Amendment never officially got approved by all of the states throughout the country. And so because of that, they didn't approve it within the timeline that was set. And so we still to this day don't have the Equal Rights Amendment. Okay, someone, especially when we talk about Equal Rights Amendment, someone whose name is always going to be brought up is Phyllis Schlafly. Okay, and she was known for being an outspoken critic against the Equal Rights Amendment. And she organized the group called Stop ERA. Okay, so STOP was an acronym for Stop Taking Our Privileges. And Phyllis was known for being conservative, trying to run for Congress a couple of times, but really being involved with the Republican Party. And her biggest statements when being interviewed or having TV segments is that she was concerned that by passing the Equal Rights Amendment, women would lose out on laws which were actually protecting them. So she was concerned that women would lose out on some of those protections, such as if you are a stay-at-home mother, you could get Social Security. Okay. Also, she was concerned that if this amendment came into play and was passed, that women would be drafted. If there was another war, that women would be required to be drafted. And again, wanting to protect women, protect the rights of women. So just things like that, where there was two sides to this argument, and because of the concern here and because of the delay in getting the votes officially done in the different states, we don't have the ERA or the Equal Rights Amendment passed. June 23rd, 1972, we see another piece of legislation that is signed by President Nixon. This is called Title IX. Okay, so Title IX is the protection of equality in educational programs or any activity receiving federal funds. This is a really big deal, especially within schools. This is something that all of your teachers, your principals, secretaries, counselors, everyone plays a role in Title IX. And it's a really big deal. So you can't, no person on the basis of sex shall be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any educational program. So when we take a look at how this law works in action, think of sports. If our school has a boys' team for a sport, we have to provide a girls' team as well. Okay? Or we need to provide an equal opportunity for both genders to be involved in that sport. Okay? We also see this when it comes to grades or bathrooms. All of these things, we have to have equal opportunity for both genders in schools. Now, you may be thinking about this title or this piece of legislation and be like, well, duh, we need boys' bathrooms, we need girls' bathrooms. That wasn't legally required up until 1972. And sports was a big piece of this legislation as well. Girls, I know that we like doing sports. You want to run, you want to be on the track team, you want to have a basketball team. Schools didn't have to provide that to you because of your sex until June 23rd, 1972. There's a couple of other pieces that come along with Title IX, which are really, really important, especially even more so today. And this is really where you're going to hear Title IX come into play, is when it comes to sexual misconduct. Okay, so if a student were to speak out against the school for sexual assault, sexual misconduct, the school is not allowed to retaliate against that student in any way. Okay, and the school has to pay for a student to receive different supports if there has been sexual misconduct within the building. Okay, so this was a really big piece of legislation, and it still is highly used in every single school today. So any program, any place that receives federal funds, has to abide by Title IX. Okay, so then let's think about this. What is not covered? What is Title IX not covered under? Well, any private school. Okay, so any charter school, religious setting school, private institutionalized schools, maybe like a daycare or whatever, if you're not receiving those federal funds, like a public school is, you're not having to enforce Title IX. Okay, so there's still some areas around the country where we don't have those protections in place, but we're getting there. Okay, that's kind of the memo of our country, is like we're working towards it, but we're not quite there yet. So here's some interesting things kind of to break down that everyone should know about Title IX. Okay, so Title IX protects all people regardless of their sex. So that's protection for both girls and boys. Schools must have an established procedure for handling sexual misconduct. In cases of sexual violence, schools are prohibited from resolving complaints through mediation. All schools must have a Title IX coordinator, so that's someone who would be an expert in the law. If your school fails to comply by these rules, file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Education. Costs necessary for a victim to pursue his or her education, such as counseling or housing changes, should be provided by the school. Schools must take immediate action to ensure a victim can continue their education free of ongoing sexual discrimination, violence, or harassment. Schools may not retaliate against a victim for filing a complaint, and schools are required to protect pregnant and parenting students from discrimination. Okay, so those are the big things that schools have to make sure that they are doing and protecting for their students. Okay, so still getting into the 1970s, 1990s. Okay, January 22nd, 1973, we have the landmark case known as Roe v. Wade. Now, I'm not going to get into much detail here. I'm not sharing any opinions, and I'm not asking you to share any opinions, but it's really important that you know that this case exists, especially in conversations about law, women's rights, things like that. So in this court case, it was a battle between what are state laws and what are women's medical decisions, and when does one supersede or take precedence over the other. And with this case, it was surrounding the concerns about abortion and women's rights for those abortions. So during this time period, we have different state laws about when, if, those kind of things of surrounding the conversation of abortion. Okay, so then we get into the conversation of, can a state have a decision in that, or is that a conversation that should only be happening between a woman and her doctor? Okay, so this is a states' right issue as well as a women's rights issue. Okay, so out of this law, out of this court case, we have three big decisions that are made, or kind of like the three-pronged decision of abortion. When we are in kind of like the first trimester of a pregnancy, the court decided that the mother has the most interest, and the mother's decision is going to outweigh the state's. Around the second trimester, or kind of getting into weeks or months 3 through 6 of a pregnancy, it's going to be a conversation with the state and the mother, where a state can determine kind of up to that point of what the law is going to be, but the woman still has a voice. Now, when we get to the third trimester of a pregnancy, which is the last 3 months of pregnancy, state law is going to supersede anything the woman can say. Okay, so it creates these three different stages, kind of based on trimester, or the months of a pregnancy, but it again is kind of giving that conversation and letting women come to the table while that conversation is being had. September 13th, 1994, we see that President Clinton signs the Violence Against Women's Act. Now, this piece of legislation provided funding for programs that address and support victims of domestic violence, rape, sexual assault, stalking, and other gender-related violence. Okay, so now we're creating federal funding for counseling, different educational programs, teaching how to look for these kind of things, whether it's in law enforcement or education, community-based even. Okay, so we're starting to see that protection against violence against women. Okay, so let's go back to that question that we had at the beginning of the slideshow. What tactics did you see that were used to start the conversations about women's rights? How do people make change? Okay, so consider. Here are some of the things that I came up with. Marches. We saw a lot of marches taking place with civil rights movements. People who are just congregating, making it known that there is a lot of the population that wants to see these changes, making it known, getting media presence on air, just spreading the word, really. And we still see marches today. Okay, we very much so see marches, especially in Washington, D.C., capitals. We have women's rights marches in Lansing, in Michigan every year. Okay, so this is something that definitely brings about change. We see protests that happen, sit-ins or protests against eating. All of those things were used for passage or to convince others for the passage of the 19th Amendment, getting women the right to vote. We see changes in law, right? Title VII, Title IX, protections for equality against maybe employment discrimination or equal opportunity, especially in the educational setting, protection for people who have seen violence or experienced violence, teaching people how to respond to those, providing money, federal funds in order to respond to those situations, all make change when it comes to talking about these conversations. We also have court cases. Okay, this is another way to change law or to solidify who's right in a conversation for the time being. Okay, we see that with Roe v. Wade. Legally at this point, we have that distinction for states' rights versus women's rights. And at this point, we kind of base our law decision-making off of this court case from 1973. So, I hope you guys enjoyed. Like I said, I highly recommend that you guys go out and do some investigating on your own at this point. Go look up Roe v. Wade. Go look up Title VII, Title IX, 19th Amendment, and consider, how did this impact me, right? Maybe you are someone that this conversation is about. Maybe you are someone who isn't yet protected by these laws. Okay, how can we help? How can we start those conversations for people who may feel like they aren't on either side of this discussion yet? Okay? Or if you're someone who has been long protected by the law, how can you help others? How can you help advocate for others, learn about these moments in order to help encourage others, speak up, whatever it is? So at this point, I'll see you guys later.